A 4-year-old woman arrived at a homeless camp in Boise with $40 and a $10 tarp. 6 weeks later, her shelter was holding 42 degrees warmer than outside, using nothing but cardboard and physics. If you want to know how she did it, subscribe and stay with me. There is a particular quality of light in Boise at the end of September that people who have only passed through the city on their way to somewhere else tend to miss entirely. It has to do with what that light means in practical terms to the people watching it move across the ground and calculating, with whatever clarity exhaustion allows, exactly how many weeks stand between that moment and the kind of cold that does not negotiate. The Greenbelt Flat Camp sat on a stretch of low ground south of the Broadway Bridge, where the cottonwood trees grew thick enough to block most of the wind off the river, and where the city had, through a combination of policy fatigue and competing priorities, arrived at a tolerance that was not acceptance, but was something that functioned like it at a distance. Between 40 and 60 people called it home on any given week in the fall of 2009, depending on what sweeps had come through and who had managed to find something more permanent and who had not. The people who had been there through previous winters knew what the September light meant. The people who were new were still learning how to read it. Amber Cole arrived on a Tuesday evening in the last week of September with a single backpack, $40 in her pocket, and a way of moving through a new space that was neither timid nor aggressive, but was instead the careful, assessing kind of movement that belongs to people who have spent time learning environments where getting something wrong has a cost. She was 24 years old. She had dark brown hair pulled back at the nape of her neck with a rubber band she had found on the sidewalk 2 blocks from the bus station. And she wore a canvas work jacket, the color of old wheat that had been broken in, past the point where it looked like anything other than what it was. The best piece of outerwear she owned. She found a spot along the eastern edge of the camp, between a stand of cottonwood trees and a low concrete retaining wall that cut the worst of the wind. She set down her backpack and stood there for a moment, looking at the ground with the focused attention of someone taking inventory of a workspace rather than a campsite, and then she began to unpack. She had been a sophomore in mechanical engineering at Boise State University on a full scholarship until her family's finances collapsed in the way that working-class finances collapse in an economic contraction, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a slow erosion that left behind a set of decisions, each one reasonable, in isolation, that added up to her leaving school at the end of her second year to take a fabrication job at an HVAC company in Twin Falls. She had been good enough at the job that her supervisor began treating her competence as a personal problem to be managed rather than an asset to be used. When she filed a complaint with HR after a series of incidents that she described in writing with the precision of someone who had learned to document things carefully, her personnel file was pulled and reviewed, and she was laid off 6 weeks later. For reasons cited as economic, which was technically true in the way that many technically true things are also something else entirely. She did not talk about this in the camp. She unpacked what she had, secured the corners of her tarp between 2 cottonwood trees in the standard A-frame configuration that everyone arriving at the camp eventually assembled, and lay down inside it that first night listening to the river and thinking, with the particular clarity that surfaces when a person has nothing left to protect except their own ability to think clearly about what the next step actually required. The tarp had cost her $10 at a discount store 3 blocks from the bus station. It was a standard 10 by 12 polyethylene sheet in blue, the kind sold folded in a clear plastic bag alongside bungee cords and cheap flashlights, the kind that everybody in the Greenbelt Flat Camp had, or something close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. In the first week, it performed the way minimum solutions perform, adequately, in the narrowest possible interpretation of that word. It kept rain off her face. It did not do much else that mattered. The night that changed her thinking arrived in the second week of October, when a front moved down from the north and the temperature dropped to 36 degrees with a wind off the Snake River Plateau that had nothing gentle about it. She lay in her sleeping bag inside the A-frame and felt the cold air moving steadily under the tarp from both open ends, felt it against her face, felt it working its way through the synthetic fill of the sleeping bag with the patient persistence of something that understands it has all night. It was not the kind of discomfort that produces complaint. It was the kind that produces silence. A cold that occupied her entire attention and left no room for anything except itself. She lay still and thought. The next morning, she opened the small spiral notebook she kept in the front pocket of her backpack and began to draw. Not randomly. She drew cross-sections. She drew airflow diagrams with small arrows indicating convective movement. She drew the geometry of the A-frame from 3 angles and annotated the failure modes. Open convection at both ends, zero thermal mass in the wall material, cold air pooling in the upper cavity. She drew a different geometry beside it, a closed rectangular form, and began working out what would need to be true for it to hold heat passively. She had done this kind of analysis in her second year at Boise State before she left. This exact kind. Thermal envelope modeling for enclosed spaces, and the knowledge had not gone anywhere in the time since. It had simply been waiting in the back of her mind for a problem that required it. An old man named Walt Pruitt was the first person to stop and look. The camp called him Crazy Walt because he talked to himself and kept odd hours and rarely engaged with anyone directly, which in a camp where everyone was already carrying something heavy translated into a certain kind of invisibility that Walt seemed to prefer. He was 68 years old, with a white beard that had grown past the point of intention and eyes that were sharper than the rest of his presentation suggested. He stopped behind Amber's shoulder and looked at the notebook for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that was fully present in a way that surprised her, "You've got your convection loss diagrammed, but you haven't accounted for ground conduction." He did not wait for a response. He turned and walked back toward his spot near the center of the camp, and Amber watched him go and then looked back at her notebook and added a ground factor to the diagram, because he was right. What she did not know, and would not know for some time, was that Walt Pruitt had spent 22 years as a thermal systems engineer at Boeing's facility in Renton, Washington, before a series of events that had nothing to do with his engineering ability had brought him to this particular stretch of ground by the Broadway Bridge. But the observation he had made in 10 seconds was an accurate one, and that afternoon, browsing the free books cart outside the public library on Capitol Boulevard, Amber found a copy of Principles of Building Thermal Envelope Design, published 1987, spine cracked, margins annotated by a previous owner in handwriting too small to read. She sat down on the library steps and read for 3 hours without stopping, and the knowledge she had assembled in pieces during 2 years of engineering coursework settled into a coherent structure that felt, for the first time since she had left school, like something she could actually use. She spent the next 3 days doing what she had done on the factory floor in Twin Falls. When a system was underperforming and the cause wasn't obvious, she observed carefully and she took notes. She walked the camp in the early morning when the air was coldest and the failures of each shelter were most legible. She noted where condensation collected, where frost had formed on the outside of tarps and where it hadn't, where the ground showed darker because someone had laid something insulating over it and the frost had stopped forming directly on the soil. She was not studying people. She was studying structures, which is a distinction that mattered to her and that shaped what she saw. By the third evening, she had 3 pages of observations and a conclusion that could be stated simply. Every shelter in the camp was addressing precipitation and nothing else. The thermal problem was being handled entirely by sleeping bags, which were doing all of the work and doing it under conditions that pushed their ratings to the edge. She sat against the retaining wall with her notebook and worked out the principles. The first was dead air insulation. Still air trapped in a confined space provides thermal resistance, and the more layers of still air you can interpose between a warm interior and a cold exterior, the slower heat moves outward. The second was radiant reflection. A surface with high reflectivity facing an interior heat source bounces radiant heat back toward that source instead of absorbing and re-emitting it outward. The third was convective blocking. If air cannot move through a space, the primary mechanism by which wind removes heat from a body is eliminated. These were not new principles. They were the principles she had studied in ENGR 242, heat transfer applications, and they were the principles that any person who has spent time doing fabrication work in the HVAC industry absorbs through repetition until they become instinct. What she had around her in the camp was not the right materials for a building, but materials and principles are different things. The materials could be substituted. The principles could not. She drew the design in her notebook. Full page, annotated. A rectangular sleeping cavity, approximately 6 feet long and 30 inches wide. Walls of double-layer corrugated cardboard, with a 1-inch air gap between layers, held open by uniform spacers cut from green branches. A roof of the same construction, angled 3 degrees to drain condensation toward one end. A floor of dense, expanded polystyrene foam, 2 inches deep, covered by the existing sleeping pad. An interior ceiling surface lined with reflective aluminized mylar, reflective side facing down. The entire structure enclosed in the $10 polyethylene tarp as an outer waterproof shell, staked out with a deliberate gap between the tarp surface and the cardboard roof to create one additional dead air layer. An entrance flap of doubled cardboard waited at the bottom to seal against light wind. She looked at the drawing for a long time after finishing it, checking each element against the physics in her head, and found nothing she wanted to change. Ray Hollis walked by while she was sitting there and stopped. He was 52 years old with the weathered look of someone who had spent most of their working life outdoors and a directness of manner that stopped well short of rudeness without being anything close to gentle. He had been in the camp almost 8 months, longer than most, and carried an informal authority in that section of the ground that came from a combination of experience and the willingness to say exactly what he was thinking at any given moment. He looked at the drawing in her notebook and said, "Cardboard's not a building material, kid." Then he walked on. What he did not say, because it was not the kind of thing he said, was that he had spent 25 years building houses and commercial structures across the Treasure Valley under the name Hollis Construction and Partners, LLC, a company that had been worth $2.3 million on paper before his business partner emptied the operating accounts and disappeared into a set of circumstances that the Nampa Police Department had investigated and eventually closed without an arrest. The knowledge behind his skepticism was real. The wound behind his manner was equally real. Amber watched him go, looked back at her drawing, and turned to the next page to start her materials list. The corrugated cardboard situation in Boise, if you knew where to look and were willing to walk, was better than it had any right to be. Ridgeline Home Furnishings on State Street set its broken down appliance and furniture boxes outside on Tuesday and Friday evenings, consolidated neatly beside the dumpsters in quantities that suggested a business doing steady volume. The regional appliance chain 2 blocks further east discarded its shipping containers on Thursday mornings. The polystyrene foam, the dense expanded variety, not the soft crumbling kind, came from inside the appliance boxes. Thick white slabs used to protect the corners of refrigerators and washing machines during shipping, cut into pieces that could be carried flat under an arm. Amber identified the sources on her first pass and established a collection schedule. Over 5 days, she accumulated double-wall corrugated cardboard in quantities sufficient to work with seriously, sorted by condition and size, stacked against the retaining wall under a corner of her tarp. She found the mylar in a recycling bin outside an outdoor sporting goods store on Fairview Avenue. A partial roll of aluminized emergency blanket material, thin as a breath, reflective on one side, crinkled from previous use, approximately 4 feet by 7. She rolled it carefully and stored it inside her backpack where it would stay dry. On the morning of the 6th day, she came back from the bathroom facilities at the park maintenance building 200 yards away and found her cardboard stack gone. Not disturbed. Gone. Every piece. She stood and looked at the empty space for a long moment, and her face in that moment was something only the cottonwood trees saw, which was the particular tightening around the eyes and the deliberate steadying of breath that belongs to people who have learned to absorb loss without announcing it. Then she followed the trail. It was not a difficult trail. Sandra Okafor's spot was 30 feet away, and the cardboard was there, propped against the side of Sandra's tent in pieces, some of it already jammed into gaps in the tent fabric where the wind came through. Sandra was 34 years old, and she had 2 children, a girl of 7 named Deja and a boy of 5 named Marcus, and they slept inside that tent on nights when the temperature in Boise fell into the 20s, with whatever insulation Sandra could find or beg or apparently take. Sandra was standing with her back to Amber when Amber arrived, and she turned around, and the look on her face was not defiance. It was the specific expression of a person who has run out of options and knows that the person looking at them is aware of it. Amber stood there for a moment that might have lasted 3 seconds, or might have lasted longer, and then she sat down in the dirt next to Sandra's tent and said, Do you want me to show you how to do this right? That was all. No accusation, no lecture about property or fairness or the inconvenience that had just been caused. Later, Amber would not have been able to explain exactly why she had responded that way rather than some other way. She had been angry, she would say if asked. But anger at the situation had a different weight than anger at Sandra specifically. Because the situation was the thing that had produced the theft, and the situation was the thing that both of them were inside. Sandra looked at her for a long time without speaking. Then she said yes. And that yes was the beginning of something that Amber did not yet have a name for, but that would prove in the weeks and months ahead to be the most operationally significant alliance she made in that camp. Because Sandra Okafor knew the Greenbelt flat like a floor plan, who had what, where things were discarded, and what arrived when. She started on a Monday and worked across 4 days, building in the methodical way that people who have fabricated things for a living tend to build, sequentially, from the foundation up, with each element completed before the next one was begun. The floor went in first, because the floor was the most important and most underestimated element, and she wanted it right before anything else existed that could distract from getting it right. Cold ground is not passive. It is an active heat sink that draws thermal energy out of a sleeping body through direct conduction at a rate that most people would not believe without a thermometer to prove it. She laid the polystyrene foam slabs 2 inches deep across the entire floor of the sleeping cavity, fitted together tightly, covered by a layer of double-wall corrugated and then her sleeping pad on top. The ground, when that floor was in place, might as well have not been there. The walls went up next, rectangular, 6 feet by 30 inches in footprint, 30 inches at the peak. Each wall was 2 layers of double-wall corrugated cardboard with a deliberate 1-inch gap between layers, the gap held open by sections of green cottonwood branch cut to uniform 3-inch lengths and positioned at intervals of roughly 18 inches along the wall's height. The branches were not elegant, but they were rigid and dimensionally consistent, and they did not compress under the weight of the cardboard panels, which was what mattered. The gap was the point. That 1 inch of still, trapped air between an outer wall sitting near ambient outside temperature and an inner wall sitting in a cavity warmed by human occupation provided a degree of thermal resistance that was modest by the standards of commercial building materials, and extraordinary by the standards of material gathered free from recycling bins and dumpsters. Sandra Okafor, who turned out to possess a spatial intelligence that she had never had a context to call by that name, proved useful in a way Amber had not anticipated. She could look at a partially assembled wall panel and identify immediately where it was going to fail under load, and she said so clearly and without performance, which was the kind of help that is genuinely rare. Jesse Warren, 21 years old and present at the camp for 6 weeks due to a set of circumstances he described vaguely and Amber did not press, came over on the second day with a kind of curiosity that has not yet learned to disguise itself as disinterest. He asked why the walls were double-layered instead of single-layered with thicker material. The answer, that a 1-inch air gap provides more thermal resistance than 1 inch of additional cardboard because still air is a better insulator than the cardboard itself, took Amber approximately 4 minutes to explain in terms that made the physics accessible without losing the accuracy, and Jesse listened to all 4 minutes and then nodded slowly in the way of someone rearranging a category in their mind, rather than just adding information to an existing one. The roof went on with the same double-layer construction, angled slightly, with one end resting on a support 2 inches higher than the other, to ensure condensation drained consistently toward one side and away from the sleeping surface. The mylar went up last, attached to the interior surface of the roof panels, with the reflective side facing down into the sleeping cavity. A human body radiates heat outward in all directions continuously, including upward. A reflective surface positioned above that body catches a significant fraction of that upward radiation and returns it downward, rather than allowing it to pass through the roof layer. The tarp went over the assembled structure as an outer waterproof shell, staked to the ground with a gap maintained between the tarp surface and the cardboard roof, one more layer of still air, one more margin of resistance. Ryan Cho showed up on the second afternoon with a notebook and a camera, having been assigned by the Idaho Statesman to produce a feature on what the paper's editor had described as the public safety concerns posed by encampments along the Boise Greenbelt. He had expected a different kind of story. He stood at the edge of Amber's work area for several minutes before he asked if he could look at her notebook. She handed it to him without comment. He looked at the drawings for a long time, and when he handed it back, his expression had rearranged itself around something that was not pity, and was not condescension, and was something closer, though he would not have used this word, to recognition. Ray Hollis came back on the third day of building, which suggested he had been watching without appearing to watch, which was consistent with the general character of his attention. He stood, with his arms folded, and looked at the wall construction for a while, and then said, in the tone of a man identifying a problem before it becomes one, "January rains are different from October rains in this valley. That cardboard is going to absorb." Amber said she knew that, and that the tarp overlapped the cardboard by 8 inches on all sides, and was staked through a sealed skirt around the base, so no lateral water could wick up from the ground. Ray looked at the staking pattern for a moment. He said it would depend on how the tarp was tensioned at the ridge. Amber showed him the ridge tensioning. He looked at it and did not say anything further, which was a different thing than disagreement. Carol Briggs arrived on the 4th day. She was in her mid-40s and had been doing outreach work at the Greenbelt Camp and several others in Ada County for 5 years, long enough to have developed the kind of practical assessment instinct that 5 years of working close to crisis produces. She asked about fire risk. Amber told her there was no heat source inside the structure except her own body, that polystyrene had an ignition temperature well above any heat that could be generated accidentally in a closed space without an open flame, and that the cardboard was not positioned anywhere near the entrance where a cigarette could reach it. Carol Briggs looked at the construction for a long time. She did not say it was a good idea. She also did not tell Amber to stop, and in the grammar of outreach work, the distinction between those two things was clear and significant. Ryan Cho's story ran in the Idaho Statesman on a Thursday. The headline was not what his editor had originally discussed. It read, "The $10 Engineer, How a 2-4-Year-Old is Solved Cold Physics with Dumpster Materials." The story ran 1,200 words, with photographs of the construction, the annotated notebook diagrams, and a diagram Ryan had drawn himself based on Amber's explanation of the 3 principles. By Saturday morning, it had been shared across Idaho, then across the Pacific Northwest, then into comment sections Amber had no awareness of because she did not have a phone that connected to the internet. The comments varied in the way that comments on stories about poverty always vary, some generous, some curious, some reflexively dismissive, in ways that revealed more about the commenter than the subject. A man named Daniel Firth, who held a chair in civil and structural engineering at Boise State University and had been reading the Statesman over Saturday morning coffee, read the article twice, and then read the annotated thermal diagrams in the photographs a third time. He closed the paper, finished his coffee, and opened his laptop. And Carol Briggs, who had begun receiving calls from her supervising organization expressing concern about the structure's compliance with Greenbelt land use regulations, came back to Amber on Saturday afternoon and said, in a tone that was apologetic but firm, that there was institutional pressure to have the structure removed before it created a precedent. Amber listened to all of this without interrupting. When Carol finished, Amber said, "It snows in Boise in November. The structure hasn't been through a cold night yet. Give me 2 weeks." Carol said she would see what she could do. An informal meeting was held the following morning. Ray Hollis, Jesse Warren, Carol Briggs, Sandra Okafor, and 3 others sitting in a rough circle in the morning light near the center of the camp. The question on the table was whether to support the structure's continued standing or to acquiesce to the institutional pressure. Ray Hollis, who had made the wet cardboard comment on day 3, spoke first. He said, "No fire risk that I can see. I don't trust the material, but she's addressed the water pathways better than I expected. Give it 2 weeks." No one in the circle had anticipated that from Ray. Across the camp, Walt Pruitt looked over from his spot and met Ray's eyes briefly and gave a single slow nod, and Ray looked away quickly in the manner of a man who prefers not to be seen being understood. She crawled into the completed structure at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night in late October, the temperature outside sitting at 29 degrees, with a light wind moving steadily from the northwest. She pulled the doubled cardboard entrance flap down behind her and lay in the dark for a moment, still and listening, in the way that you listen when you are waiting to find out whether a thing you have built from reasoning and calculation and free materials in a dumpster behind a furniture store actually does what the reasoning said it would do. What she felt within the first 20 minutes was not comfort in the ordinary sense. It was more specific than that. It was the absence of the cold that had been present every other night she had spent in this camp, and that absence had a texture and a quality that was different from what she had expected, because she had expected a degree of improvement, and what she experienced was a categorical difference. The sleeping bag was doing almost nothing. The bag itself was the same bag it had always been, and the outside temperature was colder than the night 2 weeks earlier, when she had lain in the A-frame and cataloged every failure point. What had changed was the environment surrounding the bag. It was not warm by any standard that involves a thermostat, but it was not cold in any of the ways that mattered. She lay there in the dark with the mylar overhead catching the faint ambient light that worked its way through the tarp seams, and she felt, with the clarity that physical relief from sustained discomfort produces in a person, that the thing worked. Not approximately, not with caveats, not in the way that adequate solutions work. It worked the way things work, when they have been thought through rather than guessed at, and that precision had a quality that was its own kind of warmth, distinct from the thermal kind, and sitting on top of it in a way she had not fully anticipated. The following morning, Carol Briggs convened the meeting she had promised. It was held at the rough table area near the camp center, 2 wooden pallets set end to end, and the people present were the same ones who had gathered the day before. Carol framed it directly. She needed a collective determination about the structure's future, because the institutional pressure from her organization was not going away. Ray Hollis, who had spent the night in his 3-season tent with a bivy shell over his sleeping bag, and who had woken at 3 in the morning with his feet at the edge of numbness, said what he said with no preamble. She made it through last night. I didn't hear anything about the structure failing. I'm saying let it stand through the cold snap. Jesse said he thought they should all learn how it was done. Sandra Okafor said she had been inside it briefly the previous afternoon, and that it was the warmest enclosed space she had experienced since arriving at the camp 6 months ago. Carol looked around the circle. She had been doing this work for 5 years, and she had seen improvised structures that were dangerous and improvised structures that were merely ineffective. And she had not, until now, seen one that the evidence suggested was neither. She said she would communicate to her organization that the structure had passed a preliminary thermal test and request a 2-week deferral on any removal action. It was not a full endorsement, but in the grammar of institutional outreach work, it was close enough to function like one. The cold snap arrived in the 2nd week in November without particular announcement. Weather in southern Idaho does not generally feel it owes anyone an introduction. A high-pressure system locked over the region, and the temperatures that came with it were the kind that clarify the difference between shelters that have been engineered for cold and shelters that have simply been present during it. Overnight lows ran between 8 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive nights, with wind off the Snake River Plateau adding an effective cold that the thermometer reading alone could not communicate accurately to anyone who was not outside in it. Jesse Warren, who had been sleeping in a single tarp A-frame with a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, put on every piece of clothing he owned on the 4th night and still woke at 4 in the morning, unable to feel his feet. The 2 men who had arrived from Las Vegas 3 weeks earlier had not experienced cold of this character before and said so in terms that were direct and somewhat alarmed. Sandra Okafor's children slept in the structure she and Amber had built together over the preceding 2 weeks, a modified version scaled slightly larger to accommodate 2 small sleeping bodies. And neither child missed a night of sleep during the entire cold snap, which was a fact that Sandra held in her body rather than in words, and that was visible to anyone who watched her face when she talked about it. On the 5th night, which was the first night the temperature went below 0, Ray Hollis did not come out of his tent at the usual hour. Jesse Warren noticed at 8 in the morning and went to look. Ray was conscious but slow, his lips pale, and his responses taking longer than normal to arrive, his body conserving its heat by withdrawing from its periphery in the way that bodies do when they have run the overnight calculation and found the numbers marginal. Jesse came to Amber's entrance and knocked on the cardboard flap. Amber moved Ray inside her structure and sat with him for 2 hours, folding additional cardboard around his shoulders and monitoring his color and his speech. The small space held a temperature of approximately 48 degrees in its interior, while the cheap thermometer that Carol Briggs had left at the camp 3 weeks earlier read 6 degrees outside. Ray did not speak for the first 40 minutes. When he began to speak, he talked about Nampa. He talked about the houses he had built there, a subdivision of 22 homes on the West Bench, a community center in a neighborhood that had needed one, a commercial strip he had designed the structural package for, and was proud of in the specific way that tradespeople take pride in things they built with correct technique under real conditions. He talked about his former partner in a tone that was flat and precise rather than bitter, as if he had already used up whatever heat bitterness required, and was now simply reporting facts. He had not talked about any of this in 8 months at the camp, because no one had asked, and because the camp's social contract included a general understanding that people's histories were their own until offered. Amber listened without prompting him, and without the kind of sympathetic interjection that would have made her the subject of the conversation rather than him. She simply listened. After 90 minutes, Ray's color had returned and his speech had its normal pace. He looked around at the interior of the structure, at the wall layers, at the roof geometry, at the mylar above them catching the pale winter light that came through the tarp seams, and he touched the inner cardboard surface with his palm and held it there for a moment, feeling the temperature differential between the panel's two sides. Then he said, in the same direct tone he used for everything, "You accounted for thermal bridging at the wall connections. I didn't teach that to my crew until their 4th year." He stood up carefully and went back to his spot. He did not mention the conversation afterward. Neither did Amber. But something had passed between them in those 2 hours that neither the cold nor the subsequent warmth had generated, something that lived in the specific register of one person's competence being genuinely recognized by another person who was qualified to recognize it, which is rarer than it should be and more sustaining than most things that are easier to describe. The knowledge moved through the camp the way knowledge moves in communities without classrooms, person to person, on free afternoons, through demonstration and question, and the particular credibility that comes from visible results rather than credentials. Jesse Warren built his version first, asking questions throughout that grew progressively more technical as his understanding of the principles deepened. Sandra Okafor had already built hers for Deja and Marcus, with Amber's help, during the worst of the cold snap. The two men from Las Vegas built together, making a structure large enough for both of them, and Amber held firm on the 3 non-negotiable elements each time. 2 inches of polystyrene on the floor, the dead air gap in the walls, the reflective ceiling surface. The mylar could be approximated with layers of aluminum foil salvaged from food packaging when the real material was unavailable. And she said so clearly, because the principle mattered more than the specific material, and the principle had to survive the transfer. Tom Elridge had been at the camp for 2 weeks before Amber noticed him. He was 40 years old, quiet, and kept notes in a small black notebook that he did not show to anyone. He had attended the building sessions for both the Las Vegas men's structure and the session, where Jesse had asked his most technical questions, and he had asked no questions himself and offered no opinions. Amber had assumed he was a journalist. He was, in fact, a building code compliance officer for the city of Boise, assigned to the Greenbelt camp as part of a pre-winter assessment process that had as its anticipated conclusion a set of recommendations, including a formal notice of encampment removal on grounds of structural and safety non-compliance. He had arrived with a checklist. He was leaving with something different. His report, submitted to the city's Housing and Community Development Office in the 2nd week of December, did not recommend removal. It recommended a pilot program called Emergency Thermal Shelter Standards for Unsheltered Populations, and included, as its primary technical exhibit, an annotated description of the passive insulation system Amber Cole had developed at the Greenbelt Flat Camp, with measured temperature differentials and an analysis of the physical principles involved that was accurate enough to have been written by someone with an engineering background, which Tom Elridge did not have, but which reflected the quality of what he had observed and the care he had taken in describing it. The name Amber Cole appeared in the exhibit. Daniel Firth arrived at the camp on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after his Saturday coffee and the Idaho Statesman article. He was 61 years old, with the rumpled appearance of someone who thinks about structural problems continuously and finds the management of personal presentation a lower priority than the problem currently at hand. He found Amber through Carol Briggs, who had received his email and, after a brief period of uncertainty about whether to pass it along, had decided that the decision belonged to Amber rather than to her. Firth sat down on the retaining wall next to Amber and said without preamble that the thermal envelope design she had built was a more sophisticated, practical application of passive insulation principles than most of the undergraduate theses his department had produced in the previous 5 years. Then he opened a manila envelope and placed on the retaining wall between them a single sheet, a reinstatement application for Boise State University's College of Engineering, paperwork for the Returning Student Merit Scholarship, a program that had existed for 11 years and that most advisors forgot to mention and most eligible students never found, and a letter from the department chair indicating that her prior coursework would transfer in full. He said, "This was already available to you. I just found it." Amber looked at the sheet for a long moment. Then she looked up at the cottonwood trees, bare now in December, their upper branches moving in a light wind off the river. She did not say thank you immediately. She said, "Can I have a day to think about it?" Firth said of course, and stood up and shook her hand and left. And Amber sat on the retaining wall for a long time after he was gone, looking at nothing in particular and thinking about everything at once. She accepted the reinstatement in January. She accepted the position at Cascade HVAC Systems, who had rejected her application 8 months earlier for insufficient relevant experience, and who now offered her a junior design engineer role at a salary that exceeded what she had been making in Twin Falls in the same week, after an interview in which the hiring director asked her to explain her thermal envelope design, and she did so for 18 minutes without notes and without a single statement that was imprecise. The director asked how she wanted to coordinate the two commitments, the job and school. Amber said she had thought about it, and that evening coursework in an employer tuition program would handle the scheduling, but that before she started either, she had a request. She wanted the company to supply materials for one final workshop at the Greenbelt camp. Cascade said yes. The workshop was held on a Saturday morning in early February. There were no chairs or projector or handouts produced by a printer. There was Amber, a cleared patch of ground, a set of materials organized by type and function, and the people who came to watch and to learn. Jesse Warren was there. Sandra Okafor was there with Deja and Marcus, who were both too young to follow the technical explanation, but who watched their mother watching Amber with an attentiveness that was itself a kind of education. Ray Hollis was there, standing with his arms folded in the same posture as the first day he had walked past her notebook. But the thing behind the posture was different now, recognizable to anyone who had seen the same person in both versions of themselves. Carol Briggs was there, sitting near the front, writing in a notebook. Not the outreach log she usually carried, but a personal notebook. A spiral-bound one she had bought at the drugstore the night before. Ryan Cho was there with his camera. Tom Elridge was there as himself, without the black compliance notebook, which he had left in his truck. Walt Pruitt was there, standing near the back, and he did not say anything during the session. But when Amber described the role of ground conduction as the most underestimated heat loss pathway in cold weather shelter, he tilted his head in the way of someone hearing a thing stated correctly, which was the most he ever offered as acknowledgement, and which was, from him, considerable. Amber built a demonstration module from start to finish, narrating each step in the plain language she had always used, not simplified, not performed, but the natural language of someone explaining something they have understood until the explanation comes without effort. She left behind a handwritten instruction sheet, annotated with dimensions, and the 3 principles stated clearly at the top. Sandra Okafor laminated it with a piece of clear plastic packaging material and fixed it to the center post of the cottonwood stand with a piece of wire. She packed her backpack on a Sunday morning and walked out of the Greenbelt flat camp the same way she had walked in, with the same bag, the same boots, the same canvas jacket, now dark at the elbows from 4 months of work and weather. She did not dismantle the structure before she left. She left it standing with the polystyrene floor intact and the mylar ceiling in place, because dismantling it would have cost nothing to her and might have cost something significant to whoever came next. And the arithmetic of that was not difficult. Carol Briggs submitted a formal proposal to her outreach network in March, describing the design as a replicable emergency thermal shelter system and recommending its inclusion as a required module in winter readiness training for outreach staff. The proposal included a technical appendix prepared with input from Daniel Firth's department and a cover note in Carol's own words that read, In its final paragraph, the person who designed this did not need us to believe in her first. She only needed us to stay out of the way. Amber read that note 6 months later in the apartment she had rented on the north end of Boise, a single room with a window that looked out over a parking lot and a radiator that worked. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of the canvas jacket, which she kept on a hook by the door, and went back to the textbook open on her desk. What Amber Cole had done with a $10 tarp and free materials went beyond the 3 physical principles alone. It required one more thing that no list of materials could account for: the knowledge that competence, when it has been dismissed and displaced and ground down by circumstances that had nothing to do with whether it was real, does not actually disappear. It goes somewhere. It waits for the problem that is the right shape for it. And when that problem arrives, whether it arrives on a factory floor or on a frozen stretch of ground by a bridge in Boise, Idaho, the competence that was always there finds its way back to the surface without permission from anyone, and it does what it has always been capable of doing. It solves the problem. It keeps people warm, and it leaves the door open, or in this case, the entrance flap, for whoever needs to come in next. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest and where in the world you are watching from right now.
Amber Cole arrived at a homeless camp with $40, a $10 tap, and something nobody could take from her, the knowledge of how smooth the world. She had no lamp, she finding no title on the door. What she had was a spiral notebook, a pencil, and the kind of clarity that only surfaces when you have absolutely nothing left to know except your ability to think. She drew diagram in the dust. She still did. For pattern a dog. She asked the right question until Cartwright and physics gave her answer that commercial insulation companies charge thousands of dollars to provide. Within 6 weeks, she built a shelter that held 42 degrees warmer than outside, using material pulled from dumpster. Here is what Amber Cole teaches us: competence does not imply it does not dissolve when the job disappears, when the money runs out, when the system fails you. It goes somewhere quiet and wait. It waits for the problem that is exactly the right set for it. The most dangerous assumption we make about people in high skill competence is that they have nothing to offer. The truth is usually the opposite. Sometimes the person sleeping in a cardboard shelter is the one who understands better than anyone else exactly how cardboard shelter should be built. Knowledge is not a credential, it is a tool, and tools do not care who and hand a horizon.